I want to talk about why traditional pelvic health routes do not always solve the problem. There are many, many, many different challenges that exist within the pelvis, physical challenges. These physical challenges can be anything from PCOS. Misdiagnosed PCOS is really common at the moment because people in the medical profession are not diagnosing PCOS properly. There is challenges with endometriosis. Again, there is a lot of self-diagnosis with endometriosis, or there's the word banded around when there actually could be a lot more going on before we diagnose somebody with endometriosis, and it takes years for people to be diagnosed with endo. And then of course there's also vaginismus, which is where there's pain if something is inserted. There's vulvodynia, which is a radiating pain around the vulva. Often it's challenging to know where it stems from specifically. Then there is infertility challenges, which are on the rise due to a range of issues, including the way that we live is a problem. And I see also the problem of the shutdown of the cycle from the beginning, and then the inability to understand how to conceive with ease and what it means to conceive. There's a whole host. I could keep listing off more and more, but there tends to be some kind of physical challenge that someone will be presenting with before they end up tending to their pelvic health. What we need to be moving towards is a model of looking after our pelvic health before it gets to a point of real physical challenge, where we end up physically unable to go about our day, enjoy sex, find joy within our lives as a result of something that radiates from the root. Sometimes people refer to the pelvic area as their root chakra, as their root. There's a reason for that. It's because it's our roots. Plants do not thrive unless their roots are tended to. Therefore, I don't understand how we live in a society where people ignore the necessities that are around and available to us to tend to our pelvic health. When we end up in a clinical setting to work with our pelvic health, we often miss the importance of working with ourselves as feminine beings. Let me explain a bit further. I have been on my own journey with my own pelvic health, and what I see and what I tend to talk about a lot is the challenge that we have in a society that medicalizes everything and comes from a fear-based place. We live in a society that perpetuates fear and comes from fear. You are born into fear, you then perpetuate fear, you then have a child that also is born into fear, and so on and so forth. What it takes is for somebody to stand their ground and to acknowledge that they have something that needs tending to outside of the fear-based perpetual cycle that we live in. Fear in pelvic health looks like shutting down the cycle with the pill. There is a place for the pill, there is a place for the medical teams that are involved in pelvic health, but there is also a place, often side by side, sometimes just completely separate from, sometimes it comes in at the end of a very long journey where somebody has not been truly acknowledged with everything that's going on for them, for somebody to work in a holistic model. And a holistic model, in my opinion, is basically around tending to the emotional, spiritual, physical holding within the pelvis. Every single physical manifestation within the pelvis, or that comes from a challenge with hormones, tends to be as a result of some level of trauma. Trauma can begin from birth. Trauma can begin from how you were birthed. Trauma is then perpetuated in a society that lives and breathes a lot of trauma. You may be born into an environment with trauma. You may end up in a situation such as sexual assault, and often in my spaces, I see people who have been through rape. What we need is to acknowledge that before the whole medical profession got involved in the feminine, in the pelvis, there were women who tended to women. There were women who tended to women in birth. There were women who tended to women who saw what they needed and supported them holistically. And we thrived in communities where we supported women and we supported one woman to another. Therefore, we learned from that woman, and that woman was then able to pass on their knowledge to the next woman. What happened was several things happened, but there was the witch wound. So there was the hanging of the witches, which were predominantly women who were healing and supporting others. They were hung, they were killed. So to speak up for what was needed basically meant you were killed. And medical professionals, mainly men, would come in and say, this is what is needed, this is what is needed. I've created this new fun dabby-dozy thing that can help women. And of course, not forgetting then contraceptions that came into place. So over the years, if we look into the real history of science, the medical profession, and how it has gone against how the feminine works, gone against how the pelvis works, we have perpetuated the issues, the physical issues that exist within the pelvis, which is why we see things always on the rise. We see infertility on the rise. We see cascades in births on the rise. More and more and more fear is perpetuated in the cycle, is pushed into rooms with consultants, with gynaes, with obstetricians, with midwives. People often find themselves scared to talk and speak up for what they are witnessing. The way that training happens within the medical profession is that gynae and obstetrics is just parked. It's not acknowledged. It's not even part of exams unless there's the odd question. So what we really have to acknowledge is that we as women, those with pelvises, are not acknowledged for the wisdom that comes from our true innate knowing that there's something that's not right. And often we are gaslit and ignored. We can spend a lifetime being gaslit and ignored and not heard. And then we end up potentially at perimenopause, menopause, and we have spent a whole lifetime living in fear, subconsciously or consciously, creates more challenges at perimenopause and menopause, which is why HRT has a place, but also you'll see a lot of women who will be anti-HRT and wanting a different way for them. HRT is really, for some, a band-aid on top of a lifetime of ignorance for what their feminine health really needed. So what I see in my space and my words and the way I speak to the pelvis and why I do what I do comes from seeing a shutdown of the voice for women and comes from a shutdown of the pelvis in society. And the way I tend to women is how we would have tended to women before all this other stuff came into play and created these difficult challenges that we see. There will be those who will argue that without medicine, we wouldn't have X, Y, and Z. There's always going to be those people who will argue. There will always be those people who will see my work as woo-woo bullshit work. But I don't care what anyone else thinks about the work that I do, because the women who come into my space and experience my work for all that it is will tell you that this work is what propelled them to move forward with their health. It's what allowed them to create beautiful, wonderful journeys for their relationships, for their physical health, for their emotional health, and for their spiritual health. It is not what is created within a medicalized space. My space here is a home, and women come into my home. They come into my home, they come into my hearth, they come into my heart, and I hold them in a way that they have likely never been held. They're heard, they're listened to, and they're tended to emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And when a woman is tended to in this way, mothered in this way, that's where the changes occur. It is not where the changes occur if the changes do not occur within a medicalized space. They may make things a little better. They may diagnose certain things, but their often go-to tends to be more trauma. And that trauma can come from being put back on the pill. That trauma can come from operations, sometimes necessary, sometimes unnecessary. That trauma can come from simply placing their fingers within the vagina without real consent. Sometimes that trauma can come from birth, often from birth. So to those who are ready to step away from the journey that they've been on, or to work in tandem with that space that they find themselves in, then this is where you can be held through a range of techniques that work somatically with the pelvis that have been ignored and shut down for years. And that is what my space is about. It's about reclaiming what was always ours and has been taken away from us, which includes our voices. So to work with me, I have a couple of ways. First of all, you can work in person. I'm in Margate. I also sometimes go to other towns. If you ever see that, I would highly recommend jumping in that space. Then within that space, you'll work with me for a whole month. And I really advocate for the whole month, because that's where the changes really occur, because the body begins to find safety within a deep feminine divine space that the body is not used to being within. And then I work with 6 sessions at minimum. If people don't want to work in a month container, they would rather have like every week, then they can come to me for 6 sessions, or they can come to me for 6 sessions over 12 weeks. And they look like somatic sessions that build on each other. So those are the 2 ways that you can work with me. And you can also work with me online. If there's somebody that cannot come to me in Margate, I work online, and the magic happens by showing up, being in surrender to the divine feminine and the feminine ways that we have shut down, and moving and integrating the work that you experience within the space. So I'm sending so much love, and I hope that some of that resonated.